Okay, so while Judah is off doing all this stuff with Tamar and his sons and all that, and this would have taken over the course of many years because he has three sons. Two of them grow up at least a young adulthood, maybe late teenagehood. I'm not sure exactly. So this would have all taken place over the span of a number of years. And while he's doing that, Joseph is down in Egypt. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. So we're going back in time. So Judah's timeline has gotten farther ahead of Joseph's from where we are in the story. So now we got to go back to where we were at the end of chapter 37 and kind of reset the timeline here somewhat. Back to where Joseph is. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw the Lord was with him, and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. I'm not sure how long this would have taken. Joseph would have only been 17, so I'm inclined to think that Potiphar wouldn't have immediately trusted a 17-year-old. So it would have taken a period of testing first, but I'm not sure. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. That sounds like a good deal. I wouldn't mind being that. I wouldn't mind having that sort of deal. Having a guy work for me so well. He's my slave too. He has to. It's like I have power of life and death over him legally in my culture. So he has to. If he doesn't do it, I can do anything I want to him. So all I have to do then is concern myself with eating. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." I don't know how to make bedroom eyes. Okay, it's like I don't know how to make bedroom eyes. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, "My master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" He'd be sinning against his master too, but more importantly, he'd be sinning against God. He trusts his master trusts him. He doesn't want to violate that bond of trust with his master. Having sex with his wife would do that. It would violate his bond of trust with his master. So he'd be sinning against his master. But more importantly, he'd be sinning against God. And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. So he knew that she was going to be a problem, so he avoided the problem by not being around her. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was in sight. Uh-oh, he's going to be alone with her. Was this a setup? Maybe. It doesn't say that it was. It may not have been. It may have been total coincidence. It also may have been a setup. Don't know. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." Again, I don't know how to make bedroom eyes. I don't know how to do that. I'm not exactly the alluring type. Okay. And I haven't been allured either. Okay. It's like I'm not the sort of person that women do this to. I'm not a woman. I haven't done it myself. I haven't done it to women either, whatever the masculine form of it is. And I haven't had it done to me. I have not had women allure me this way. So I've got to admit, I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to act that way convincingly. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. So he just wiggled out of it somehow and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, so she has the evidence. Just like with back in the day, they didn't have DNA tests. So they gave Joseph this coat of colors covered with animal blood. And Joseph had no way of telling the difference between that blood and a human blood that he presumed was Joseph's. He couldn't run a DNA test to prove whose blood it really was. Okay? He just had to assume it was Joseph's because he knew it was Joseph's coat, and Joseph's coat, who else would be wearing his coat but Joseph? And what else could have happened? But he was torn to pieces by an animal, and there's the blood. So that's the only conclusion he can reach. Here, they don't have DNA tests. They can't prove that Joseph didn't have sex with the wife. Okay, it's like, but he did leave this piece of evidence behind that she can now manipulate. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. So they were somewhere nearby. Maybe she sent them away to set Joseph up. I'm not sure, because she apparently could call them wherever they were. So they weren't too far away. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. I don't think anybody else heard the scream because there was no scream. But that's the story she's going to tell. And Joseph's just a slave, so he's not going to have the authority to argue with it. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. So she's probably sitting there on the bed, her legs crossed and looking all proud and mighty of herself, and waiting for her husband to come home so he can punish that slave. Then she told him the story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard this story, his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me. He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Now, it doesn't say he burned with anger at Joseph. I tend to think he probably didn't burn with anger at Joseph. Because I think if he had, he probably would have had Joseph killed. He would have had the authority to do that. I think he probably would have done it. I think he's burning with anger because he knows he's going to be losing Joseph, and probably isn't going to be losing Joseph for legitimate reasons. He can't do anything but put Joseph in prison. I mean, he could kill him. But he can't do anything to keep Joseph around and make use of him still. I think he's angry he's going to be losing such a useful servant. I don't think he's angry at Joseph. I don't really think he believes that Joseph did what his wife is claiming that he did. But he can't disprove it and has to go along with it in order to preserve his own place in society. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Sometime later, don't know when, don't know how many years later, Joseph went into Egypt at 17. He was made prime minister or vizier at 30. The timeline in between is not stated. We don't know how long he was in Potiphar's house. Don't know how long he was in prison. We know that he was in prison for at least 2 years, because there's a 2-year gap between this story here in chapter 40 and the next one when he gets let out. So this is happening when he's 28. Because it's 2 years later, beginning of chapter 41. So we know that much. But we don't know when he was in prison. Was he 18? Was he 20? Was he 20? Still 17? Was he 27? Was he 28? Somewhere between? Don't know. My guess is he was probably in prison for at least a few years. Because I think God allowed this to happen in order to scrub out any last traces of arrogance or haughtiness that he may still have had. Because he clearly had it when he was younger. Now, I'm not so sure he was still 17 when he was okay, because I don't know if Potiphar would have put a teenager in charge of his household. Even if he, I don't know. I don't know how old he would have had to have been to have that kind of respectability or reputation, even with the Lord's blessing. I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. And I also don't know how long he would have taken, because a 17-year-old can be attractive. I'm thinking he might have been a little bit older than that to be fully developed as a man before he was that irresistible to this woman. So my guess is that he probably was a full-grown man, fully developed in his manhood by the time Potiphar's wife became really lustful towards him. So I don't think he would have still been 17, because a 17-year-old male is not fully developed yet. He may have been appealing to her in his innocence. He may have been innocent at 17 or 18, and that might appeal to her. But the text says he was well-built and handsome. A 17-year-old male is not done growing, so my guess is that it's probably happening when he's in his early 20s and is fully developed as a young male physical specimen. But I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. Here, they were probably part of some sort of coup. Okay, so one thing you have to understand about this, and we are getting now into the Egyptian tie-in of the Old Testament here, is that most countries in that region, in that time period in the ancient world, this is actually true for a long time, a long period, didn't really have prisons as we commonly think of them today. When we get to the law of Moses, for example, the common penalty for most offenses, or a lot of offenses, is death. If someone does something, commits a crime or breaks a law, even things that we would consider relatively not that big of a deal, a lot of times the penalty is death. Or maybe excommunication, being put out of the community. Sometimes you just have to pay a fine, pay back what you stole or were responsible for someone losing or something like that. But there were a lot of times when you were just put to death. Okay, or excommunicated. You know, there really was no such thing as a prison sentence. In ancient Israel, when you committed a crime, you really weren't put in prison. Ancient Egypt, when you committed a crime, you really weren't put in prison. Any of these countries, like they didn't really have a prison system that we would think of today. If you offended the crime itself, I mean, essentially the idea of crime itself doesn't really exist the way that we do today. The crimes that would merit attention would be the ones that were against the king. If you, for example, the cupbearer and baker had done something to offend the king, then you might be put in prison. You probably would just be executed, like one of them ends up being. Which one is it? The baker, I think. Yeah, the baker. You probably would just end up getting put to death, most likely, because they weren't going. They didn't have the resources or the money or the desire even to waste putting on people who are in prison. Like it would be easier and simpler just to kill them or excommunicate them and get them out of your hair. It's like it would have been a waste of resources to feed and clothe and shelter people who committed crimes that you put in prison. Like that just wasn't part of their consciousness, their public consciousness. Like I said, there's no real penalties of imprisonment in the law. You just don't do that. You have excommunication. You have like exile, like put them out of the community. But it's like you don't really have the idea of like locking them up in a small room and just like keeping them there indefinitely. That didn't really factor into the ancient way of thinking. So the idea of a prison itself here is somewhat rare. Like you don't really have that many prisons in the ancient world. So the idea of there being a prison in Egypt at this time itself is somewhat rare. But the idea of this prison is probably these prisoners were probably people who had offended the higher officials in some way or another. They weren't going to bother putting a lot of people who had defended like the commoners. Like you might make you a slave or something like that. But the idea of just like locking you up for a period of time just doesn't. Like they just wouldn't have made much sense to them. Even here, I'm not sure really what sort of a prison this is. Seems to be somehow in the house of the captain of the guard. Like, what is that, the basement? Like what exactly does that mean? Like later on in the Old Testament, when Jeremiah is imprisoned by the evil king of Judah at the time, like they don't really have a prison for him to go in. They just like put him in an area. They put him in a well or they put him in a room. And they don't really have a prison to put him in. Just the idea of having like a dedicated space where you lock people up who commit crimes, just they didn't think of it the way that we think of that sort of thing today. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph. So Pharaoh put these two guys in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. So he's basically a model prisoner who's been allowed a certain degree of authority over the other prisoners who may not be so model. That's pretty much what he is. He himself can't leave. He's still a prisoner, so he can't leave. But he has allowed some degree of independence over the other prisoners because he's a model prisoner. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Pharaoh came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house. So this is still Potiphar's house, somewhere in his basement or something. Why are your faces so sad today? We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. So he's not as arrogant about the dreaming as he was back when he was 17. Even Jacob, his dad, got after him about that second dream. Now Jacob himself had dreams. My guess is that Jacob had told his sons about his dreams, probably repeatedly. And Jacob had his own dreams and thus thought that was a sign that he was the favorite. He knew he was already Jacob's favorite, all these J names. He knew that he was already his father's favorite, and he probably believed that by getting dreams from God, that marked him as God's favorite too amongst his brothers, and he was eager to let that be known. Now he's not quite so eager. He's not quite so haughty about sharing the interpretation of dreams. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. Part of the responsibility of the cupbearer was to actually sample the food and drink for Pharaoh in case they were poisoned. Nehemiah will be the cupbearer to the king of Persia much later on. Same thing. Not only do they preserve the king's food to him, they will probably sample a taste of it first to make sure it isn't poisoned. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison, for I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. So Joseph's got some gripes about life. He doesn't think he deserves any of this. He was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and he's done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. He wants out of here. He doesn't think he needs to be here any longer. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. The baker would be the guy, I guess, who probably made the food. So if anyone's going to poison the food, it'd be the baker, now wouldn't it be? The cupbearer is the one who tests the food for poison. The baker might be the one who actually tried to make the poison, huh? On my head, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread, or 3 wicker baskets. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within the 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh. That's probably not what this guy wanted to hear. Well, now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged, or impaled on a pole, the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to him in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. That's going to be enough for that today. So basically, these two guys would have been involved in some kind of a plot against Pharaoh. As the cupbearer and the baker, they would have had access to Pharaoh's food and water and drink, and could have poisoned him if they had chosen to. The cupbearer's part of his job was actually to sample the food and water drink for Pharaoh and keep him from being poisoned. If anyone's going to actually put poison in the food, it would be the baker. So my guess is that after a period of time, during the period of time in which these two men were in custody, Pharaoh was conducting some sort of an investigation to figure out who might have been behind a coup attempt of some kind to try to get rid of him. And so that when he finished his investigation, he discovered that the cupbearer was innocent and the baker was guilty. So then he executed the baker and restored the cupbearer to his position in accordance with the dreams that Joseph had interpreted for them. Probably they're receiving these dreams around the time that Pharaoh is making his decision. And of course, his birthday's coming up in a few days, so he's probably making the decision to announce the results of the investigation at that time. So they're probably having the dreams right about that time, and then Joseph provides the interpretations for them. So that's probably what really is going on there. Again, the idea of prison itself wouldn't have been very common in the ancient world. But they might have been keeping these two guys in custody for a while the Pharaoh was trying to investigate what was going on. My guess is that there was some sort of a coup attempt, and that Pharaoh was trying to investigate who was involved in the coup, and discovered that the baker was, or the cupbearer wasn't, or something along those lines. We're going to get into some of the details of Pharaoh and Egypt as we go through with this. This is, of course, the point in the Old Testament when Egypt's history intersects and links with Israel. Or I should say, Israel's history intersects and links with Egypt's. And this is, of course, a major point in our contention today, because when we look at what we consider the Egyptian record, we don't find what we think we should find in terms of evidence supporting the links. And so this has been a big problem in last 50 years or so, trying to figure out how the history links up between these two different nations. And we'll definitely be talking about it. I've already done 3 different videos of 20 minutes in length or longer today. I have a headache and I'm definitely done for the day. But as we go through, and we have plenty of time, because this is going to go all the way to the end of Exodus, or halfway through Exodus, and so we have plenty of time, and I'll be covering some of this information. I have done a lot of research into this myself, and I'll be covering a lot of this material as we go. But right now, I'm just going to say that I'll do it, but not right now.